Hello Matul students. This is an introductory video for lesson 2 in our multicultural ministry class. I wanted to kind of introduce the themes that we're going to be reading through this week, and the topic has to do with models of inclusion in Scripture, to look for ways in which God has initiated a sense of inclusion for those on the margins. Oftentimes when we read through the narratives, they serve as an archetypical model of intercultural ministry, in that they show that God was reaching people on the margins and using them for the redemption of cities. The people of God are often depicted as marginal citizens, whether in Egypt or even among the nations. They were always on the margins, and they are similar to the culturally marginalized in our churches today. And so Scripture often reveals them, the marginal people, as tied to the welfare of the cities. And so he was able to use people like Joseph and Moses, people on the fringes and on the outsides, and they were very key to the central or the blessing of those cities. Another thing to remember in reading through the Scripture stories is that God is always the hero of the story. Never lose sight of that. He's always the supreme protagonist, the number one person, regardless of whether the book is titled after God or not. We have books named after Samuel or Joshua or various people in Scripture, but God is always the hero. The story is always telling us what God did, and it reveals His missional initiatives in the world. So we want to recognize what God was doing and duplicate or implement those models in our churches today. When we move into the poetic books and the wisdom books, we see that wisdom was used by God as a natural bridge for those on the outside to have the same language as those on the inside. Wisdom literature is obviously the most international, the most universal literature in the Bible. The things you see biblical leaders talking about in the wisdom literature are the same things you hear other nations talking about. So people have the same concerns, whether they were Israel or other nations. It reveals a shared concern about life, about death, and about eternity. So they spoke the same language, and you find that in the wisdom literature. A man in today's contemporary society may ask the question, why did my wife die? And in a scientific, with a scientific philosophy in a society like ours, an autopsy may answer those questions for him. But Scripture tends to take us to those moral or spiritual kinds of answers, and it addresses things morally and spiritually, the kinds of things that lead to death, not necessarily physical death. And so it's talking about moral and spiritual death. So oftentimes we confuse the two and get them tied together, that a person can still be living and die because of moral and spiritual choices. Whereas oftentimes today in our contemporary society, we will answer those kinds of questions of death and not see that people die in other ways. So wisdom literature kind of affirms that that people in other societies have the same concerns that Israel did. And so Israel did not monopolize on that conversation on concerns about life and death, nor does the church today. There are other sources of wisdom that we can glean from, whether they be scientific or technological. So as you do the reading there, look for those themes. The prophets, moving on to the prophets, they reveal God's concerns for those at the margins in other ways, that God always raises up someone to be a voice for the voiceless. And the prophets served in that capacity. They would speak for God to awaken the conscience of those who have power and have overlooked the needs of those that have no power or are voiceless in society. From the prophets, we'll talk a little bit about the Gospels, and they reveal God's incarnational love how he was willing to come from heaven to earth and live among us to experience life the way it is experienced here on earth in a fallen world. And we can thank Christ for being able to want to cross those boundaries and discover for us, knowing all things, but to experience all things on our behalf and for our benefit. As we move into the book of Acts, you see that there is a community of sharing, reciprocal sharing, of giving and receiving. These are models of ministry that show what it takes to be multicultural, reciprocal sharing, loving one another. In the early church, they established a village economy where everyone relied on everyone else in order to survive. And so they were their church life, their social structure was entirely different than the social structures of Jerusalem. And so that speaks to us that churches may not be beneficial for churches to share the same social structures as our environments. That perhaps we should move to a more village type of economy where there is reciprocal sharing. The epistles, as you move into the epistles, they kind of resonate the message of God's love, His incarnational love, as they challenge us to be like-minded with Christ. But I also bring up the topic of engaging the powers, and I spend some time. You'll see some images, and I ask the question whether Popeye is there or Bluto, and I introduced that cartoon to you because Popeye makes an interesting statement. As Bluto says that Popeye can't win a fight because he's bigger and stronger. That same concept, that same philosophy exists in the world, that the biggest and the strongest will always win. But Popeye seems to stand on the idea that right will eventually win. And so I ask that question, I pose that question to you as students, and I show you some illustrations to ask whether or not you see Popeye present, or his philosophy, or the philosophy of Bluto. And so this idea that I present, I also present with the option, a third option. In Joshua, in the book of Joshua, in fact it's in chapter 5 verse 14, Joshua is confronted by the commanders of the army of the Lord, the commander of the armies of the Lord, and he asks this angel, this image, which we believe is a pre-incarnate image of Christ. He asks Joshua, or Joshua asks the angel, whose side are you on? And the angel responds, I'm on neither your side nor your enemy's side, which tells me that there's a third option, that there's another path forward, that sometimes the enemy, obviously the enemy's option is not the option we want to live under, but sometimes our own conceptions of what is right may not be absolutely right. It may not be God's right. So the question that Joshua should have asked is not, are you on our side or on the side of our enemy, but how can we walk with God and His initiatives for our community? And so I introduced these two ideas of a domination system versus God's domination-free system, where even churches can be domination systems. We need to check ourselves there. So the reading has to do with those ideas in that area, in the area of the epistles. And lastly, I talk about Revelation 7 verses 9 through 10. Revelation chapter 7 verses 9 to 10 present a wonderful image of God's diverse, culturally diverse people in worship together, people from every tongue and language worshiping, and I can imagine them, even in their cultural dress, in their cultural music, worshiping the Lamb together. What a beautiful image of inclusion, a beautiful image of interculturality, not just tolerating one another, but to blend together and joining one another in worshiping the Lamb. So if you have any questions about this week, please feel free to write to me, call, send a question in the forums section, and I hope to see you soon next week. God bless.